transforming differences in conflict from a liability to an asset. There is a way to deal with those differences, those disagreement that is productive, that is generative, as opposed to a liability and toxic. Curiosity is so important, and it's most important generally when it's hardest to do. From a pure enlightened self-interest perspective, if I understand them better than they understand me, I've got a lot of power to shape the situation for my own benefit. People, human beings, are social animals.
John, you've written for some of the top journals in our field. Is there a piece or framework you've published that you think best captures your thinking on how companies should approach negotiation or, like you mentioned, collaboration today?
So whether it's managing conflict, whether it's negotiation, whether it's strategic alliances, whether it's a piece a couple of years ago on innovation and kind of open collaborative innovation between companies, transforming differences in conflict from a liability to an asset. And again, kind of relating negotiations, business strategy, overall strategy, kind of connecting that to ultimately, right, all these things do come down to people and how people interact. So that, I guess, as it's emerged over the decades and for what time remains for me, that's kind of the uniting theme of a lot of the work that I have done, public and private sector.
Do me a favor. What's that theme one more time so I can make sure I write that one down?
Differences and conflict, right? Conflict in a non-pejorative sense, but that just a clash of I want this, you want that, or I think this is the best approach and you think something different. So that disagreement and conflict can create gridlock. It can stress or damage relationships. It can often be a liability, but there is the potential, and it's all about not conflict or not, it's how you deal with it. There is a way to deal with those differences, those disagreement that is productive, that is generative, as opposed to a liability and toxic. So that's kind of the thing, is how do you translate or transform those differences in conflict to be an asset rather than a liability? So it drives innovation. It drives better decision-making. You and I disagree. Probably the odds are neither one of us has a monopoly on the truth in the situation. And if we can be curious about those differences, not try to negate them, but learn from them, put our different perspectives together in a synthetic way, we're probably going to come out with better ideas, better decisions, more creative solutions. In terms of business partnerships or alliances between companies, there's this irony. That's why you form an alliance in the first place. You have different business models, you have different expertise, you have different capabilities, you sit within a different part of the value chain out in the marketplace. That's why you come together, is that 1 + 1 = 3.
But let's say you're coaching a junior consultant, someone who's a little newer. If you boiled it down to a single kind of coaching point to this consultant trying to help an organization, what would you tell them to do or not do?
I mean, maybe a couple things. I mean, I would tell them to try really, really hard to be curious. Curiosity is so important, and it's most important generally when it's hardest to do, right? And it's hardest to do when I'm like, intellectually, I know I don't know everything about the other side or the other person, but viscerally, I'm pretty sure that of what's relevant, I know everything I need to know about the person and the situation. But until you see how other people see the situation, you just don't have a lot of power. And even when we think we have no power because the other company is bigger or the other person in the situation is more senior, the power that is always available to us is to look more broadly, to look more deeply, to understand the other side better than they understand us. Which again, like I've had this conversation with myself and with clients. Well, why should I bother to understand them? They don't care at all about my point of view. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't feel great, but the reality is, from a pure enlightened self-interest perspective, if I understand them better than they understand me, I've got a lot of power to shape the situation for my own benefit.
What advice would you have for me if I'm facing a powerful supplier, difficult customer? What frameworks or tools could you teach me in reframing the negotiation approach or protecting long-term value?
If your counterparty, customer, supplier, alliance partner, some other group in a different context, if they are more powerful, a couple things. One is try to understand them and their goals as well as possible, because maybe there's something outside the scope of our current negotiation or issue, some other goal, need, interest that they have that's not part of our current interaction. But once I understand, they also care about this, then I start to say, well, is there some way I could help them with that other goal? And if I did offer up some value, some support, some way to help them there? Could I then leverage that back, right, to get some consideration within the current negotiation? So that would be one thing, is just try to understand them, their motivations and needs as much as possible. Two is, typically when I look at a counterparty and I think, well, they have a lot more power than I do, right? The paradigm behind that or around that is, I need them a lot more than they need me. And therefore they've got more power. But often that starts with, I have to get an agreement with them. I have to get their approval. I have to close this deal with them. And if not, it's terrible for me. So often in my experience, if I set that aside and say, okay, it would be terrible for me not to get an agreement with the other side, but let me just imagine for a moment from their perspective, how bad is it if they don't get a deal with me? And a lot of times it turns out that'd be really bad for them too. So the fact that I am incredibly dependent on them doesn't mean that they're not also, maybe not completely as much, but very, very dependent on me. And again, this is classic with any kind of stress. Well, now it starts to look a little bit more balanced. And again, the other thing would be to rethink what power is. I can, who can hurt who most, which is a typical way to think about power. Human beings are social animals. And not just social, but eusocial or hypersocial. What does that mean? Well, one thing is, none of us want to be taken advantage of or mistreated. And I've seen over the decades so many business deals unraveled that from a business or financial perspective made sense. But one side or the other side came to believe that the other side is trying to take advantage of me. And all of a sudden, people will walk away or blow up deals that if it was just about money, they'd do it. But that drive to be fairly treated is incredibly deep-rooted. It's incredibly powerful. The flip side, though, is where the power of legitimacy comes into play. Not only do we all as human beings care deeply about being fairly treated, we also want to be seen by those around us, because we're social animals, as reasonable and fair dealing. And we learn that we need to explain why and justify ourselves to others. If the other side does have a lot of power, I don't want to get into a battle over, based on coercive power. I'm going to lose that. If I can shift the ground to what's fair, what's reasonable, and put what I would say is a constructive form, a positive form of pressure on the other side to live up to ideals that almost everyone has, which is, yes, I am a fair and I'm a reasonable person. Let me use that kind of pressure to create power for myself in a negotiation, without otherwise I wouldn't have it.
Do you find it more difficult to align internal parties or external customers and clients and so forth?
Everyone, whether you're in procurement, corporate development, doing joint ventures and M&A, sales, account management, whatever the role is, whenever I've asked people, are your negotiation influence challenges, are they harder externally or internally? It's always internal. On the face, it's puzzling because inside our organization, even though we're different departments and business units and offices, but we're still part of one company, or we're still part of one unit or one department in an agency, as in so much in life, is a function of expectations. Just for fun, I will analogize to movies. Some of the movies I've enjoyed most have been because I had no expectation whatever. I went to the movie, I was like, this is a great movie. Some of the movies I've been more disappointed in, it's because I've heard overhyped so long, and it probably was a great movie, but my expectations had been raised so high. I went saw the movie, I was like, yeah, this is pretty good. But we have an unrealistic expectation of our colleagues inside the same organization that we're all one group. We're all one team. And so there shouldn't be friction and disagreement and conflict. And that unrealistic expectation gets dashed pretty quickly. And then we get really frustrated. When we're out with external partners, we're like, yeah, of course. They've got their own goals, their own priorities, and we expect some of that. And then we're not as rattled by it when it happens. I think that, so I'll stop there, but I'm kind of curious. It's so universal, and it's such a strong view from people that, yeah, the internal is harder than the external. Why is it so much that way? It's fascinating to me.
if you had one final piece for our listeners on how they might transform how they negotiate, persuade, influence, and collaborate.
When we are encountering very aggressive or what seems to be very aggressive behavior from the other side, that aggression has its roots in fear. Kind of counterintuitive. And again, when someone is attacking me and being aggressive, natural human reaction is defense and maybe attack back. It is not to say, wait a second, like if the other side is really as powerful as they say, like think about when you've really engaged in negotiations with someone who had all those people are generally pretty chill. I don't necessarily need the deal with you. I'll talk to you. They're not aggressive because they don't need to be. When people are really aggressive, it generally comes from deep-seated insecurity and fear. And if I can recognize that, then the overwhelmingly effective strategy is not to fight fire with fire and like blow the whole thing up. It is how can I reduce the level of fear and anxiety that person is experiencing. You got to have the wherewithal to take the temperature down, which starts by helping them become less fearful. But again, it's so counterintuitive that when we're being attacked, that's often what's driving it on the other side. And if we recognize that, we can help make it safer, like less fearful for them. That's not going to make it easy or solve the problem, but it's probably the only way to start charting a path to a favorable resolution.
Well, that is it for us on today's podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NegotiateX podcast if you haven't already. We'll see you in the next episode.